The headlights cut through the rain like a blade across glass, and for a split second, the world narrowed to a single image. A woman standing in the middle of the road, one hand pressed protectively over her stomach, her eyes steady as if she had already decided how this moment would end. Ethan Cole slammed his brakes, the tires whispering against wet asphalt as his car came to a controlled stop just feet from her. The storm swallowed everything else, the distant hum of traffic, the glow of city lights, the rhythm of his own thoughts, until there was only her silhouette framed in white light and falling rain. He stepped out, the cold hitting him instantly, soaking through his tailored coat within seconds, but he barely noticed. His focus locked on her. She didn't run. She didn't wave for help. She didn't even flinch. Most people, caught in the middle of a road at night, would panic. They would move, shout, react. She simply stood there, breathing slow, eyes fixed on him with a calm that didn't belong in a moment like this. Ethan moved closer, his shoes splashing through shallow puddles, his voice low but firm. "You're going to get hurt standing out here." She blinked once, rain clinging to her lashes, but said nothing. Up close, he noticed the details, the way her fingers curved slightly over her abdomen, not in fear, but in instinct. Protection. The realization settled in quietly before the words ever formed. She was pregnant. "Can you walk?" he asked, softer now. She hesitated, just for a second, and that hesitation said more than any answer. Ethan didn't wait. He stepped forward, careful, deliberate, giving her time to step back if she wanted to. She didn't. When he reached her, he placed one hand gently at her elbow, the other hovering just enough to guide, without forcing. Her body was colder than it should have been, her coat thin against the weather, but her posture remained upright, controlled. No panic, no collapse, just quiet endurance. "Let me take you somewhere warm," he said. Another pause. Then, finally, she nodded once. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was permission. He guided her to the passenger side, opening the door and steadying her as she sat. Even then, her hand never left her stomach. Ethan closed the door and circled back to the driver's seat, the interior of the car wrapping around them in muted silence as the rain continued its steady rhythm against the windshield. He started the engine, the soft hum filling the space, and pulled back onto the road. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The city stretched out ahead, blurred by water and light, the wipers moving in steady intervals like a metronome marking time. Ethan glanced at her briefly. She sat with her head slightly tilted back, eyes closed, but not asleep. Her breathing was measured, controlled, as if she had practiced holding herself together for a long time. "There's a hospital about 10 minutes from here," he said. "I want to make sure you're okay." Her eyes opened slowly. She turned her head just enough to look at him, and for the first time, he saw something shift in her expression. Not fear, not relief, recognition. It was subtle, almost hidden, but it was there. His grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. "Have we met?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then looked away. "No," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, low, and controlled, but something about it lingered in his mind longer than it should have. Ethan nodded once, though the answer didn't settle anything inside him. The rest of the drive passed in silence, the kind that wasn't empty but full of things unspoken. When they arrived, the hospital entrance glowed under fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the darkness outside. He parked near the front and stepped out quickly, moving around to her side again. This time, when he opened the door, she didn't hesitate as long. She accepted his hand, letting him help her out, her fingers cool against his. Inside, the air was warm, sterile, filled with the faint scent of antiseptic and quiet urgency. A nurse approached, her expression shifting instantly when she took in the situation. Within minutes, they were guided into a private room, the sounds of monitors and distant footsteps creating a steady background hum. Ethan stood near the foot of the bed as the doctor spoke, his attention sharp, focused in a way it rarely was outside of boardrooms and negotiations. "She's stable," the doctor said, reviewing a tablet. "But she needs rest, and we'll want to monitor the pregnancy closely." Ethan's gaze flicked up. "How far along?" The doctor scrolled briefly, then answered, "Just over 5 months." The number landed heavier than expected. 5 months. Ethan nodded slowly, his expression neutral, but something in his chest shifted, subtle and unfamiliar. The doctor continued, outlining next steps, but the words blurred slightly at the edges of Ethan's focus. 5 months. A timeline. A quiet calculation began forming in the back of his mind, uninvited. He pushed it aside immediately. It didn't matter. It couldn't. When the doctor finished and stepped out, the room fell into a softer silence. Ethan turned slightly, his eyes settling on her again. She was awake now, propped slightly against the pillows, her hand still resting where it had been all night. Protective. Constant. He studied her for a moment, the pieces not quite fitting but refusing to stay separate. The rain had stopped outside. The world had moved on. But something about this moment held him in place, like the first step of a path he hadn't realized he was standing on. "You're safe here," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. She looked at him again, that same unreadable calm in her eyes. But this time, there was something else beneath it. Not gratitude. Not relief. Something deeper. Something that felt like it had been waiting. "I know," she said. And for reasons he couldn't explain, those 2 words didn't feel like trust. They felt like truth. The monitor beside her bed traced a steady rhythm. Soft beeps cutting through the quiet like a metronome that refused to let the moment drift, and Ethan Cole found himself watching the line rise and fall, as if it could explain something he could not yet name. He had stood in rooms worth billions of dollars, negotiated deals that reshaped entire industries, but none of that prepared him for the stillness inside this small hospital space, where nothing moved except time and breath. Amara Hayes did not speak again after those 2 words. She rested back against the pillow, her gaze drifting toward the window where the last traces of rain clung to the glass in thin, uneven lines, catching the city lights beyond. There was no tension in her posture, no visible strain, but Ethan noticed the way her hand never left her abdomen, fingers curved with quiet certainty, as if that single point anchored her to everything that mattered. He stepped closer, stopping just beside the foot of the bed, careful not to invade her space, yet unable to pull himself away. "Do you have someone I can call?" he asked, his voice measured, neutral, the same tone he used when approaching unfamiliar territory. She did not answer right away. Her eyes remained on the window, reflecting a faint shimmer of distant headlights passing below. "No," she said finally, and the word landed without hesitation, without doubt. Ethan studied her profile, searching for any sign of uncertainty, any flicker that suggested she was protecting someone or hiding something, but there was none. It was not loneliness. It was decision. "You should not be alone," he said, the words coming out more firmly than he intended. This time, she turned her head slightly, enough to meet his gaze again, and there it was, that same calm recognition that unsettled him in a way he could not justify. "I am not," she replied, her hand pressing lightly against her stomach as if the answer required no further explanation. Ethan exhaled slowly, nodding once, though the exchange left something unresolved between them. He shifted his weight, glancing briefly toward the door before looking back at her. "The doctor will want to run more tests in the morning," he said. "I will make sure everything is handled." She did not thank him. She did not question him. She simply watched him, her expression unchanged, and for the first time, Ethan felt the subtle shift of power in the room. It was not in what she said. It was in what she did not need to say. He moved to the chair near the window, sitting down with controlled precision, his posture straight, his hands resting loosely together as if he were still in a meeting that required composure. The silence stretched, but it did not feel empty. It felt deliberate. After a few minutes, her breathing slowed further, her eyes closing again, not in exhaustion but in trust of her own stillness. Ethan remained where he was, his gaze drifting back to the monitor, then to her, then to the faint outline of the city beyond the glass. 5 months. The number returned, uninvited, threading itself into his thoughts despite his efforts to dismiss it. He leaned back slightly, his mind moving through timelines with the same precision he applied to business forecasts, dates aligning, gaps narrowing, possibilities forming. There had been a period, months ago, when he had stepped away from everything, when he had vanished from his own schedule under the excuse of recalibration, a word his board accepted without question. He had traveled without announcement, avoided calls, ignored obligations. It had been necessary, he told himself at the time, a reset. But now, that stretch of time no longer felt distant. It felt specific. He closed his eyes briefly, a fragment of memory surfacing without permission. A quiet evening, not in a boardroom or a penthouse, but somewhere smaller, less defined. A conversation that did not revolve around numbers. A woman whose presence did not demand attention, yet held it completely. He opened his eyes again, the image slipping away before it could fully form, leaving behind only the echo of something unfinished. Ethan stood, moving toward the window, his reflection faintly visible against the dark glass. He barely recognized the expression staring back at him. Not confusion, not concern, something sharper, something closer to awareness. Behind him, the soft shift of fabric signaled movement. "You are still here," Amara's voice came, quiet but clear. He turned slightly, meeting her gaze once more. "Yes," he said. She studied him for a moment, her eyes steady, then asked, "Why?" The question was simple, but it carried weight far beyond its single syllable. Ethan considered his answer carefully. He could have said obligation. He could have said responsibility. He could have said nothing at all. Instead, he chose honesty, or at least the closest version of it he could reach. "Because I was there," he said. "And now I am not leaving until I know you are okay." Her expression did not change, but something in the room shifted again, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the first movement of a door that had been closed for too long. "You left before," she said. The words were quiet, almost soft, but they struck with a precision that cut through every layer of control Ethan had built over the years. He did not respond immediately. He could not. His mind searched for context, for explanation, for any reason that would make sense of what she had just said, but none came fast enough. "I do not know what you mean," he said finally, his voice lower now, more measured, but not as certain as before. Amara held his gaze, unblinking. "You will," she replied. Then she turned her head away again, closing her eyes as if the conversation had already reached its end. Ethan stood there, the silence pressing in around him, heavier than before. For the first time since he had stepped out of his car into the rain, he felt something shift beneath the surface of his control, something that could not be managed or redirected. It was not fear. It was recognition without clarity, truth without confirmation. He moved back to the chair slowly, sitting down once more, his posture unchanged but his thoughts no longer aligned. Outside, the city continued as it always did, lights moving, people passing, time unfolding without pause. Inside that room, however, something had already begun to change, something that would not return to what it had been. Ethan did not reach for his phone. He did not call his assistant. He did not schedule his next move. He simply sat there, watching the steady rise and fall of the monitor, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to stay exactly where he was without trying to control what came next. Morning light entered the room slowly, not in a rush but in a quiet, deliberate way, slipping through the blinds in thin golden lines that stretched across the floor and climbed the edge of the bed where Amara Hayes lay still, her breathing even, her hand resting in the same place it had been the night before, as if time had not moved her at all. But Ethan Cole had not slept, not really. Because the moment her words settled into him, they refused to leave, and now with the storm gone and the city fully awake beyond the glass, everything felt sharper, clearer, and far less easy to ignore. He stood near the window again, jacket draped over the chair behind him, sleeves rolled once at the cuffs, a detail that would have surprised anyone who knew him in boardrooms where every line of his appearance remained exact, controlled, intentional. But here that control had thinned, replaced by something quieter and more uncertain. 5 months. The number returned again, not as a thought now, but as a presence, something that moved with him as he turned back toward her. Watching as her eyes slowly opened, adjusting to the light without any trace of confusion. She did not startle. She did not search the room. She simply woke as if she had expected everything to be exactly where it was, including him. "You stayed," she said, her voice soft but steady, carrying none of the surprise most people would have felt. Ethan inclined his head slightly. "Yes." There was a pause, but it did not stretch uncomfortably. It settled between them like something already understood. A nurse entered shortly after, moving with quiet efficiency, checking monitors, adjusting settings, speaking in a tone that was gentle but practiced. Ethan stepped back slightly, giving space without leaving, his attention shifting only when the doctor followed, tablet in hand, expression composed. "Good morning," the doctor said, offering a brief nod. "We will run a few routine tests today, just to make sure everything remains stable." Amara nodded once, her expression unchanged. Ethan listened closely, asking precise questions about care, nutrition, observation schedules, each one measured, controlled, but beneath it something else moved, something that made him listen not just as a man used to responsibility, but as someone searching for confirmation he had not yet asked for. "And the baby?" he asked, the words coming out more directly this time. The doctor glanced at the screen. "Strong heartbeat. Everything appears normal." Ethan absorbed that quietly, nodding once, though the word strong echoed in a way he did not expect, as if it carried weight beyond medical reassurance. When the doctor left, the room returned to its quieter rhythm, the sound softer now, more contained. Amara shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket over her legs, her movements careful but not fragile, controlled in the same way everything about her seemed to be. Ethan stepped closer again, stopping at the same distance he had kept before, close enough to speak, far enough to respect the boundary she had never needed to state. "You said I left," he began, his tone even, though the question beneath it had sharpened overnight. She looked at him without hesitation. "You did." There was no accusation in her voice. No anger. Just fact. Ethan held her gaze. "I do not remember leaving you," he said. "Then you were not paying attention," she replied, just as calm, just as steady. The words landed differently than anything she had said before, not louder, not harsher, but more precise, as if they were not meant to wound, but to correct something that had been allowed to exist unchallenged. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of something slipping beyond his control. He exhaled slowly, then shifted his approach. "Tell me when," he said. "Tell me where." Amara's eyes softened just enough to register the question, but she did not answer immediately. Instead, she studied him, as if measuring not his words, but his readiness to hear what came next. "You came to a place you said you needed to forget," she said finally. "You stayed long enough to remember something else instead." The image returned again, stronger this time, less fragmented. Not a boardroom, not a hotel he regularly used. Somewhere quieter. A small restaurant, maybe. A conversation that did not feel like strategy. A night that did not follow a schedule. Ethan felt the edges of the memory begin to connect, though the center still remained just out of reach. "I spoke to you," he said slowly, more to himself than to her. "You listened," she replied. "You said you were tired of being seen for what you built." Ethan's breath caught slightly, not enough to show, but enough for him to feel it. That was something he had said. Not often. Not to many people. "And then?" he asked. Amara's hand shifted slightly over her stomach, a small movement, but deliberate. "And then you left," she said, "before I had anything to give you except the truth." The room seemed to quiet further around them, as if even the machines understood the shift in the moment. Ethan processed her words carefully, aligning them with the fragments in his mind, the timeline tightening, the distance between possibility and reality narrowing in a way he could no longer dismiss. "You could have contacted me," he said, though even as he spoke the words, they felt incomplete. Amara shook her head once, slow and certain. "You made sure I could not," she said. Ethan frowned slightly. "That is not something I would do." "It is something you did not notice," she corrected. "There is a difference." The distinction settled deeper than he expected. Not intention. Absence. Not action. Indifference. Ethan looked away briefly, his gaze dropping to the floor before lifting again, his composure still intact, but thinner now, less certain. "And now," he asked, "what do you expect from me now?" Amara did not answer right away. She adjusted slightly against the pillow, her posture still calm, still grounded, as if the question did not carry urgency for her. When she finally spoke, her voice remained the same, steady, unwavering. "Nothing," she said. The word did not feel like rejection. It felt like truth. Ethan held her gaze, searching for any sign that she wanted something more, something hidden beneath the surface, but there was none. "She meant it." "That is not how this works," he said quietly. It is how it has worked for 5 months, she replied. The statement closed the space between them in a way nothing else had. 5 months. Alone. Not because she had no options, but because she had chosen not to reach for them. Ethan straightened slightly, his mind already shifting, recalibrating, not to regain control, but to understand how to move forward in a situation that no longer responded to control at all. I am not leaving this unfinished, he said. Amara's expression did not change, but something in her eyes flickered, not surprise, not resistance, but acknowledgement. You already did, she said softly. And for the first time since he had stepped into that rain, Ethan Cole felt the full weight of a truth he had not chosen, could not negotiate, and could not walk away from, settling into place with a certainty that demanded more than logic, more than strategy, something he had never needed before and now could not ignore. The sound of a pen clicking somewhere down the hallway echoed faintly into the room, a sharp, rhythmic noise that did not belong to the stillness inside, and yet it pulled Ethan Cole back into a world he understood, a world where decisions were made quickly, cleanly, without hesitation. But when he looked at Amara Hayes again, sitting quietly with her hand resting over the life she had carried alone for 5 months, that rhythm felt distant, almost irrelevant, like something from a life that no longer fit the moment he stood in now. He moved slowly, not toward the door, not toward his phone, but closer to her, stopping at the same careful distance he had maintained since the night before, a line he did not cross because she had never invited him to. There are things I can arrange, he said, his voice controlled, measured, but quieter than it had been in any negotiation he had ever led. A private doctor. A place where you would not have to worry about anything. Security. Support. He paused, watching her reaction closely. You would not have to do this alone anymore. Amara did not respond immediately. She lowered her gaze briefly, her fingers shifting slightly against her stomach, tracing a small, almost absent motion, as if grounding herself before she answered. When she looked back at him, her expression remained calm, unchanged, but there was a clarity in her eyes that made the space between them feel sharper. I was not worried, she said. The words were simple, but they carried a quiet weight that did not match the scale of what he was offering. Ethan held her gaze, trying to understand how someone in her position could speak with that level of certainty, not out of denial, but out of something stronger, something rooted deeper than circumstance. That does not mean you should not have more, he replied. More is not always better, she said, her voice even. Sometimes it is just louder. The statement settled into the room like a truth that did not need to be defended. Ethan exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance slightly, his mind shifting again, recalculating not in terms of leverage, but in terms of approach. Then tell me what you need, he said. Not what I think you need. What you do. Amara watched him for a long moment, as if weighing the question not for its content, but for its intent. Finally, she spoke. Consistency, she said. Ethan blinked once. The answer not what he expected, not something that could be arranged with a call or transferred with a signature. Consistency, he repeated, quieter now. She nodded once. Not for me, she added, her hand pressing gently against her stomach. For what comes next? The room seemed to narrow around that sentence, everything else falling away until only that single word remained between them. Ethan absorbed it slowly, understanding not just what she said, but what it implied. Not presence for a moment, not solutions for a problem, something sustained, something proven over time. He had built his entire life on control, on outcomes, on measurable results. This was none of those things. This was something that could not be guaranteed, only demonstrated. You are asking me to stay, he said. Amara tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. I am not asking you for anything, she replied. I am telling you what matters. Ethan felt the distinction settle deeper than any negotiation he had ever entered. There was no demand here, no leverage, only truth. He nodded once, slower this time, his thoughts aligning differently than they had before. Then I will stay, he said. The words came out steady, but without the sharp certainty that usually followed his decisions. This was not a decision he could enforce. It was one he would have to live into. Amara did not react the way most would. She did not smile. She did not relax. She simply held his gaze, as if waiting for something beyond the words themselves. For how long? She asked. Ethan did not hesitate this time. As long as it takes. She studied him again, That same quiet evaluation, not of his confidence, but of his understanding. After a moment, she gave a small nod, not of acceptance, but of acknowledgement. The kind that did not grant permission, but did not reject presence either. It was the closest thing to an opening he had been given. A soft knock at the door broke the moment. A nurse entered, carrying a small tray, her movements gentle, respectful of the atmosphere she stepped into. She explained the next round of tests, her voice calm, professional, but Ethan barely registered the details. His focus remained on Amara, on the way she listened without tension, without fear, as if everything happening around her was simply part of a path she had already accepted. When the nurse finished and stepped out again, the room returned to its quiet rhythm, but something had shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. Ethan reached for his phone then, not out of habit, but with intention. He stepped slightly aside, keeping his voice low as he made a brief call. "I need my schedule cleared," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Indefinitely." There was a pause on the other end, confusion no doubt, but he did not elaborate. "Handle it," he added, then ended the call before questions could follow. When he turned back, Amara was watching him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharper now, as if she had just seen something she had not expected. "You are not a man who disappears," she said. It was not a question. Ethan slipped his phone back into his pocket. "I am learning," he replied. The words surprised even him, not because they were untrue, but because he had never needed to say something like that before. Amara's gaze softened slightly, just enough to register the shift. Not trust, not yet, but something closer to recognition. Outside the window, the city continued its steady motion, unaware of the quiet transformation taking place in a single room high above the street. Inside, Ethan Cole stood without the armor that had defined him for years, and Amara Hayes remained exactly as she had been from the moment he found her, calm, grounded, unshaken. Between them, something new had begun to form, not built on power or obligation, but on something far less certain and far more difficult to earn. And for the first time in his life, Ethan did not try to control it. He simply stayed. The afternoon light settled differently in the room, no longer sharp like the morning but warmer, stretched thin across the walls and floor, as if time itself had slowed just enough to be noticed. And Ethan Cole found himself aware of things he would normally ignore: the quiet shift of fabric when Amara Hayes adjusted her position, the soft hum of distant conversations beyond the door, even the steady rhythm of her breathing that seemed to anchor everything else in place. Hours had passed since his call, since the moment he chose to remain without knowing what that truly meant. And yet nothing about the space felt stagnant. It felt active in a way that required no movement, as if something unseen was unfolding between them with every passing minute. He had stepped out briefly earlier, not to leave but to arrange what he could without disrupting what he could not control, speaking in low tones in the hallway, instructing his assistant to redirect meetings, to hold calls, to create distance between him and the world that usually demanded his presence. But even as he did, his attention never fully left the room behind him, never fully detached from the quiet certainty that waited there. When he returned, she had not asked where he went. She had not needed to. She sat the same way, composed, her hand still resting over her stomach. Her posture unchanged, as if her sense of stability did not depend on whether he was there or not. Now, as he stood near the window again, his reflection faint against the glass, he turned back toward her, noticing the way her gaze followed him, not with curiosity, not with expectation, but with awareness, as if she registered his presence without needing to question it. "You are used to movement," she said, her voice soft but clear, breaking the quiet in a way that felt intentional. Ethan paused, considering the statement before responding. "I am," he admitted. "Stillness is not something I practice often." Amara nodded slightly, her eyes lowering for a moment before returning to him. "Stillness shows you things movement hides," she said. The words settled into the space between them, simple yet layered, and Ethan felt the weight of them more than he expected. He moved closer again, stopping at the familiar distance, his posture less rigid now, less defined by control and more by presence. "And what do you see?" he asked. She did not answer right away. Instead, she studied him again, not intensely, not critically, but carefully, as if observing something that had not fully revealed itself yet. I see a man who does not know what to do when he cannot fix something, she said. There was no judgment in her tone, only clarity. Ethan let out a quiet breath, the corner of his mouth shifting slightly, not quite a smile, but something close to acknowledgement. That is accurate, he said. Most things in my life respond to action. This is not most things, she replied. He nodded, accepting the correction without resistance. I am beginning to understand that. A brief silence followed, but it felt different now, less uncertain, more grounded. Ethan glanced at the chair but chose to remain standing, his attention still fixed on her. You have been doing this alone, he said after a moment. 5 months is not a small amount of time. Amara's expression did not change, but her gaze softened just slightly, not in vulnerability, but in reflection. Time moves differently when you are not waiting for someone else, she said. Ethan absorbed that quietly, the statement revealing more than it appeared to on the surface. And you were not waiting, he said. No, she replied. Waiting assumes expectation. He nodded slowly, understanding the distinction she was making, even if it unsettled something deeper in him. Then what were you doing? He asked. Amara's hand shifted again, a small, deliberate movement, her fingers tracing a gentle line across her stomach as if marking the answer physically before speaking it aloud. I was preparing, she said. The word carried weight, not dramatic, not emphasized, but solid, grounded in something that did not require explanation. Ethan felt that word settled differently than the others, not as a concept, but as a reality that existed independent of him, something that had been built without his presence, without his input, without his knowledge. Preparing for what? He asked, though part of him already knew. Amara met his gaze fully this time, her expression steady, unwavering. For a life that does not depend on whether you stay or leave, she said. The honesty in her voice did not push him away, but it removed any illusion that his presence alone could change what had already been established. Ethan stood still, letting the words take their place without interruption, without defense. He had built his world on influence, on the ability to shape outcomes through decision and control, but here, in this room, with her, none of that applied. And now, he asked, his voice quieter than before. Now you are here, she said. That is all that has changed. Ethan exhaled slowly, nodding once, recognizing the truth in that statement even if it left him with more questions than answers. He reached for the chair this time, sitting down with a measured motion, leaning forward slightly, his forearms resting on his knees, his posture open in a way it rarely was. I want to understand what that means, he said. Amara watched him for a moment, then shook her head slightly, not in refusal, but in correction. Understanding comes after consistency, she said. Not before. The reminder was subtle, but firm, and Ethan accepted it without argument. He leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting briefly toward the monitor before returning to her. Then I will start there, he said. Amara did not respond verbally this time, but the small shift in her expression, the slight easing in her shoulders, signaled something had registered, something had been acknowledged even if it was not yet accepted. Outside, the light continued to change, the golden tones deepening as the day moved forward, casting longer shadows across the room. But inside, the space remained steady, anchored not by what had been resolved, but by what had begun. Ethan Cole did not check his watch. He did not calculate the hours he had given up or the meetings he had postponed. For once, time was not something he managed. It was something he moved through, moment by moment, without control, without certainty, and for the first time, he did not try to change that. He simply stayed, not because he had to, but because leaving no longer felt like an option he could choose without consequence. The evening settled into the room slowly, the light outside fading from gold into a deeper blue that pressed softly against the glass, and the city beyond began to glow in scattered points of white and amber, each one distant, separate, moving on its own path while inside the room everything remained anchored in a stillness that now felt intentional rather than uncertain, and Ethan Cole sat where he had been for what felt like hours. Though he had not checked the time once, his focus resting. Not on the world he had paused, but on the woman in front of him who had never needed that world to begin with. Amara Hayes shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket across her legs as the temperature in the room cooled with the evening air, her movements unhurried, precise, as if she had long learned how to conserve energy without ever appearing fragile, and Ethan noticed the detail immediately, the way she moved not out of discomfort, but out of awareness, and something about that detail stayed with him longer than it should have. "You notice everything," he said quietly, the words slipping out before he filtered them. Amara glanced at him, her expression unchanged but her eyes attentive. "You only think I do because you are not used to being observed," she replied. Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair, considering that. "Most people do not observe," he said. "They react. Most people are waiting for something," she said. "That makes them miss what is already there." The statement settled between them, and Ethan found himself looking at her differently, not as someone he needed to understand quickly, but as someone whose presence required patience he had never practiced before. A nurse entered briefly, checking vitals again, adjusting the monitor, offering a quiet smile before stepping out, and the interruption felt almost distant, like a reminder that the world still existed beyond the conversation unfolding in the room. When the door closed, the quiet returned, but it felt deeper now, more grounded. Ethan shifted forward slightly, his hands resting together, his posture less guarded than it had been earlier in the day. "Tell me something," he said. "Not about what I missed. About what you built." Amara's gaze lingered on him for a moment, as if weighing the question. Then she looked down at her hand resting over her stomach, her fingers tracing a slow, familiar pattern. "I built stability," she said. "Not comfort, not ease. Stability." Ethan nodded once, absorbing the distinction. "What does that look like?" he asked. She looked back at him. "It looks like knowing that no matter what happens, I will not be caught off guard again," she said. "It looks like making decisions before they are forced on you." The words carried a quiet strength that did not ask for acknowledgement, but it commanded it anyway. Ethan felt something shift again, deeper this time, not just recognition, but respect that did not come from position or influence, but from the clarity she carried so naturally. "And you think I am something that disrupts that," he said. Amara tilted her head slightly. "I think you are something that has not proven otherwise yet," she replied. Ethan let out a quiet breath, a faint exhale that carried more weight than it sounded. "That is fair," he said. The honesty did not come easily, but it came without resistance. Another moment passed, the room holding steady around them, the monitor continuing its quiet rhythm, the city outside growing darker as lights replaced the fading sky. Ethan's phone buzzed once in his pocket, a brief vibration that would normally pull his attention instantly, but he did not reach for it. He did not even acknowledge it beyond the awareness that it had happened. Amara noticed. She did not look at his pocket, did not ask who it was, but her eyes shifted slightly, registering the choice he had just made. "You are ignoring something important," she said. Ethan shook his head once. "No," he replied. "I am choosing something else." The distinction lingered in the air, subtle but significant, and for the first time since he had entered that room. Amara's expression softened in a way that was not just acknowledgement, but something closer to approval, though she did not say it aloud. "That is new for you," she said. "It is," he admitted, "and I do not know if I am doing it right." Amara's gaze held his, steady, unwavering. "You are not supposed to do it right," she said. "You are supposed to do it consistently." The reminder landed with quiet force, reinforcing what she had already told him, but this time it felt less like instruction and more like expectation. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that this was not something he could solve in a moment, not something he could accelerate with effort or resources. It would require time, presence, and something he had rarely offered without condition. He stood then, moving toward the window again, his reflection clearer now against the dark glass, the outline of the city behind him sharper, more defined. He watched it for a moment, the movement, the constant flow, the world that continued without pause, and for the first time, he did not feel pulled toward it. He turned back to her. "What is the child's name?" he asked. The question was simple, but it shifted something in the room immediately, something deeper than any of the conversations before it. Amara's hand stilled for a moment, her fingers resting flat against her stomach as if the question had reached further than expected. She did not answer right away. Instead, she looked at him, really looked this time, not measuring, not evaluating, but searching for something specific. "I have not decided," she said finally. Ethan frowned slightly. "You have had 5 months," he said. "I have had 5 months without interruption," she corrected. That is different from deciding. The distinction caught him off guard, but it made sense in a way that aligned with everything she had shown him so far. And now, he asked. Amara's gaze softened slightly, her hand moving again in that slow, protective motion. Now there is something else to consider, she said. Ethan held her gaze, understanding what she meant without needing her to explain it. Not obligation, not expectation, possibility. The room seemed to settle around that realization, the weight of it quiet but undeniable. Ethan nodded once, not pushing further, not claiming a place he had not earned, but not stepping back from it either. Then, take your time, he said. Amara studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, the kind that did not close the conversation, but did not need to continue it either. Outside, the city lights burned steadily against the dark, and inside, something far less visible continued to take shape. Something built not on urgency or control, but on the slow, deliberate movement of trust that had not yet been given, but had begun to find a place to grow. Ethan returned to the chair, sitting down again without checking the time, without reaching for his phone, without trying to calculate what came next, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed the unknown to exist without trying to resolve it, because leaving it unfinished no longer felt like an option he could accept. The night deepened beyond the window, the city now fully lit in 1,000 scattered points that shimmered against the glass like distant signals, and inside the room, the quiet had shifted into something more settled, more defined, as if the space itself had accepted that neither of them was leaving, not yet, and Ethan Cole sat with a stillness that no longer felt unfamiliar. His posture relaxed in a way that would have seemed impossible just a day ago, his attention no longer divided between this moment and the next obligation waiting for him somewhere else. Amara Hayes had not moved much, but the subtle changes were there if someone paid close enough attention. The way her shoulders rested more naturally against the bed, the way her breathing aligned with the steady rhythm of the monitor, the way her hand remained constant over her stomach, not tense, not protective in fear, but grounded in something deeper, something that did not need to prove itself. Ethan watched that detail again, the consistency of it, the quiet repetition, and he understood that this was what she meant, not a single gesture, not a moment of presence, but something sustained, something that did not change when circumstances did. "You are thinking too much," she said suddenly, her voice soft but precise, cutting through the silence without disrupting it. Ethan glanced at her, a faint shift in his expression that might have been surprise if it had been anyone else. "That is not unusual for me," he replied. Amara's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest she recognized the pattern. "No," she said, "but this is different." Ethan leaned back in the chair, considering her words. "How?" he asked. She turned her head toward him, her gaze steady, unhurried. "Before, you thought about what you could do next," she said. "Now you are thinking about what you cannot undo." The distinction landed with quiet precision, and Ethan felt it settle deeper than anything else she had said so far, not because it was unexpected, but because it was exact. He exhaled slowly, his eyes dropping briefly to his hands before returning to her. "That is also accurate," he admitted. Amara nodded once, as if confirming something she had already understood. "That is where most people get stuck," she said. "They stay there, trying to rewrite something that has already happened." Ethan watched her closely, sensing there was more behind the statement than just observation. "And you did not," he said. It was not a question. Amara's gaze shifted slightly, her eyes softening, not in vulnerability, but in reflection. "No," she said. "I did not have time to stay there." The words carried a quiet weight, not heavy with regret, but grounded in necessity. Ethan absorbed that, recognizing the difference between choice and circumstance, between someone who had the luxury to dwell and someone who had to move forward regardless of what had been left behind. "So you moved on," he said. Amara shook her head slightly. "No," she replied. "I moved forward." Ethan paused, the correction subtle but significant. "There is a difference," she added. "Moving on suggests leaving something behind. Moving forward means you carry it with you, but it does not control where you go." The explanation settled into him with a clarity that felt both simple and complex at the same time, and for a moment, he found himself without a response, not because he disagreed, but because he had never considered the distinction in that way before. He stood then, moving slowly toward the side of the bed, not too close, not crossing the boundary, but closer than before, his presence now less cautious and more intentional. "And what am I supposed to do with that?" he asked quietly. Amara met his gaze without hesitation. "You do not do anything with it," she said. "You live with it." The answer was not what he wanted, but it was what he needed, and he recognized that immediately. He nodded once, the motion slow, deliberate, as if accepting something he could not change but could no longer ignore. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, the sound now familiar, almost grounding, and the room seemed to hold that moment between them without pushing it forward or pulling it back. After a while, Ethan spoke again, his voice softer than before. "There is something I need to know," he said. Amara waited, her expression open but unreadable. "If I had stayed," he began, the words careful, measured, "would you have told me?" The question hung in the air, quiet but heavy, carrying more than just curiosity, carrying the weight of everything that had not happened. Amara did not answer immediately. She looked at him, really looked, as if considering not just the question, but the man asking it. "Yes," she said finally. "I would have told you." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not sharply, not painfully, but enough to register, enough to shift the way he stood, the way he breathed. "And what would you have expected?" he asked. Amara's hand moved again, that same slow, deliberate motion over her stomach, grounding herself before she answered. "Nothing," she said. Ethan frowned slightly. "That does not make sense," he replied. "It does," she said. "Because expectation would have meant I needed something from you. I did not." The clarity of her words left no room for interpretation, no space for assumption, and Ethan realized in that moment that everything he had been taught about responsibility, about obligation, about what was owed and what was given, did not apply here in the way he had always understood it. "Then why tell me at all?" he asked. Amara's gaze softened slightly, not in weakness, but in honesty. "Because it would have been the truth," she said. "And the truth does not belong to one person." The statement settled into the space between them, filling it in a way nothing else had, and Ethan felt the full weight of it, not as a burden, but as something that demanded acknowledgement. He nodded slowly, the movement almost imperceptible, but real. "I understand," he said, though part of him knew that understanding would take more than a single moment. Amara watched him for a moment longer, then leaned back slightly, her posture relaxing again into that steady, grounded position she seemed to return to no matter what was said. Outside, the city lights remained constant, the world continuing its rhythm, but inside the room, something had shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to mark the passage from one understanding to another. Ethan returned to the chair, sitting down with the same quiet presence he had maintained all evening. But this time there was something different in the way he held himself, something less defined by what he could control and more shaped by what he was learning to accept. And for the first time, he did not measure that change, did not analyze it, did not try to turn it into something actionable. He simply allowed it to exist, the same way she had allowed everything else, steady, consistent, and undeniably real. The night stretched deeper into silence, the kind that settled not just around the room but inside it, soft and steady, as if time itself had chosen to slow down in respect of something unfolding quietly between two people who no longer needed noise to fill the space. And Ethan Cole remained where he was, seated just a few feet from Amara Hayes, his presence no longer defined by tension or uncertainty, but by something far more deliberate, something that had begun to resemble patience. The city outside had not dimmed, but it felt farther away now, its movement reduced to distant flickers of light that no longer pulled at his attention the way they once would have. And for the first time in years, Ethan did not feel divided between where he was and where he needed to be next. He was simply there. Amara shifted slightly, the movement small but intentional, her hand gliding slowly over her stomach before resting again in its familiar place. And Ethan noticed the pattern immediately, not because it was new, but because it had become consistent, something he had begun to recognize without effort, without analysis. "You are learning faster than most," she said, her voice quiet, breaking the silence in a way that did not disturb it. Ethan looked at her, a faint crease forming between his brows, not in confusion, but in consideration. "About what?" he asked. Amara's gaze held his, steady, grounded. About being present without trying to control what happens next, she said. Ethan leaned back, slightly, letting her words settle before responding. I am not sure I would call that learning, he said. It feels more like not knowing what to do. Amara's expression softened just slightly, not in amusement, but in recognition. That is where it starts, she replied. The statement lingered, simple yet layered, and Ethan found himself nodding once, slowly, accepting the unfamiliar ground beneath him without trying to reshape it. A quiet pause followed, but it no longer carried uncertainty. It felt intentional, like a space that allowed something deeper to surface without being forced. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair, his posture open, his hands resting loosely together as his gaze drifted briefly to the monitor before returning to her. There is something I have not asked, he said. Amara waited, her expression unchanged, giving him the space to continue. Why were you there, he asked. In the road. The question carried more than curiosity now. It carried context, connection, the need to understand not just the moment they met, but what led to it. Amara did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved toward the window, toward the faint reflection of city lights against the glass, as if the answer existed somewhere beyond the room before returning to him. Because I was leaving something behind, she said. Ethan studied her carefully, the phrasing precise enough to invite more questions, but restrained enough to require patience. What were you leaving, he asked. Amara's gaze held his for a moment longer, then shifted slightly, her expression steady but quieter now, more inward. A place that no longer fit what I was building, she said. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding the shape of that answer even if the details remained unspoken. And you chose to walk away, he said. Amara tilted her head slightly. I chose to continue, she corrected. Ethan exhaled softly, a faint acknowledgement of the distinction she continued to make between what most people assumed and what she actually meant. Were you going somewhere specific, he asked. Amara's lips curved just slightly, not into a smile, but into something close to it. I was going somewhere quieter, she said. Somewhere that would not interrupt what I had already started. The words carried a quiet determination, not dramatic, not heavy, but grounded in intention, and Ethan felt that again, that same recognition that her life had not been paused, had not been waiting, it had been moving forward with or without him. And now, he asked, does this change that? Amara looked at him, her eyes steady, clear. No, she said. It changes how I move, not where I am going. The answer settled into him with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. He nodded once, accepting it, not as rejection, but as truth. Then I will move with you, he said quietly. Amara did not respond right away. She studied him again, that same careful observation, but this time there was something different beneath it, something less guarded, though not yet open. You do not know what that means yet, she said. Ethan held her gaze. Then I will learn, he replied. The words came without hesitation, but without the sharp certainty he once relied on. They were steady, grounded in intention rather than control. Amara's hand shifted again, that familiar motion over her stomach, and for a moment, her gaze dropped to it, her expression softening in a way that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with what she carried. When she looked back up, there was a subtle change in her eyes, not trust, not yet, but something closer to allowance. Learning takes time, she said. Ethan nodded. I am not in a hurry, he replied. The statement hung in the air, quiet but significant, and for the first time since they had met, it did not feel like something he was saying to convince her. It felt like something he had accepted himself. Outside, a distant siren passed, its sound faint and brief, swallowed quickly by the city's constant motion, but inside the room, nothing shifted, nothing broke the steady rhythm they had established. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees again, his posture reflecting not tension, but engagement, presence that did not demand response. There is something else, he said. Amara looked at him, waiting. If I had known, he began, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. If I had known about you, about the child, I would not have left. The words were not defensive. They were not an attempt to rewrite what had happened. They were simply stated, offered without expectation. Amara listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but her eyes focused, attentive. When he finished, She did not respond immediately. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, measured, as if the weight of his words needed time to settle before anything else could be said. Finally, she spoke. "But you did not know," she said. Ethan nodded once. "No," he admitted. Amara held his gaze. "And I did," she continued. "That is the difference." The statement did not accuse him. It did not diminish what he had said. It simply placed the truth where it belonged, balanced, unaltered. Ethan absorbed it slowly, recognizing the line she had drawn, not to separate them, but to define what had been. "Then I will spend the time I did not have before," he said. "Now." Amara watched him for a long moment, the room holding steady around them, the quiet deepening but not closing. Then, slowly, she gave a small nod, not agreement, not acceptance, but acknowledgement, the kind that allowed something to continue without confirming where it would lead. And in that moment, with nothing dramatic shifting, nothing loud or visible changing, something real took root between them, not built on promises or urgency, but on something far more difficult to earn, something that required time, presence, and the willingness to remain even when nothing demanded it. And for the first time, Ethan Cole did not question that path. He simply stayed. The first hint of dawn arrived quietly, not as a sudden change, but as a gradual softening of the darkness beyond the window, where the city lights began to dim one by one, stooped by a pale blue horizon that stretched across the glass like a promise of something new. And inside the room, the shift in light revealed how much had already changed without either of them needing to name it. How the space no longer felt like a temporary stop, but something closer to a place where time had chosen to pause and wait. Ethan Cole had not moved far from where he had been, but his posture had changed again, less guarded, less defined by the need to anticipate, and more shaped by the quiet acceptance of simply being present, his attention steady on Amara Hayes as she opened her eyes slowly, adjusting to the light without any trace of surprise, as if she had already expected the world to continue exactly as it had the night before. "You stayed again," she said, her voice calm, not questioning, not surprised, just acknowledging what had become consistent. Ethan inclined his head slightly. "I said I would." The words were simple, but they carried something deeper now, something reinforced not by repetition, but by action. Amara watched him for a moment, her gaze steady, then shifted slightly, sitting up just enough to rest more comfortably against the pillows, her hand moving instinctively over her stomach, as if confirming that everything remained exactly as it should. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, a quiet confirmation of something growing, something real, something that did not depend on either of them speaking. Ethan stood, moving toward the window briefly before turning back, the morning light catching the lines of his face in a way that made him appear less defined by control and more by something still forming. "You are leaving today," he said, not as a question, but as a recognition of the natural progression of things. Amara nodded once. "Yes." There was no hesitation in her answer, no uncertainty, only clarity. Ethan absorbed that, his gaze steady, his mind already adjusting to what that meant, not in terms of logistics, but in terms of presence. "Where will you go?" he asked. Amara did not answer immediately. She looked toward the window, toward the city that was beginning to wake, then back at him. "Somewhere that does not require explanation," she said. Ethan felt the weight of that statement, the quiet boundary it carried, and he nodded once, respecting it without pressing further. "Then I will make sure you get there safely," he said. Amara tilted her head slightly, studying him again, that familiar evaluation returning, but this time it felt less guarded, more open to what he was offering without fully accepting it yet. "You do not need to do that," she said. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "I know," he replied, "but I am choosing to." The distinction settled between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence carrying more meaning than words could have. A nurse entered shortly after, her presence gentle, professional, confirming discharge details, offering instructions in a calm, measured tone that filled the room briefly before fading again as she stepped out. Ethan listened carefully, absorbing every detail, not because he needed to manage it, but because he needed to understand it, to remain connected to what came next without taking control of it. When the door closed again, the room felt different, not in its structure, but in its purpose, as if it had reached the end of one phase and was preparing for another. Amara shifted again, slowly moving to the edge of the bed, her movements careful but steady, her posture unchanged in its quiet strength. Ethan stepped closer instinctively, not crossing the boundary, but ready to assist if needed. She did not reach for him. She did not need to. She stood on her own, adjusting her balance with a calm certainty that spoke more than any reassurance could. Ethan watched closely, not with doubt, but with awareness, recognizing that her independence was not something to be replaced, but something to be respected. "You have done this alone," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Amara glanced at him, her expression neutral but attentive. "Yes," she said. Ethan nodded slowly, the acknowledgement settling deeper now, not as information, but as understanding. "You will not have to anymore," he said. The words were not forceful, not demanding, but they carried intention. Amara held his gaze, and for a moment, the room seemed to narrow around them again, the weight of what he said resting between them without being accepted or rejected. "That depends," she replied. Ethan waited, giving her the space to finish. "On whether you can do what you said," she added. "Consistency." The word returned, steady, unchanged, the foundation of everything she had already made clear. Ethan nodded once. "I understand." Amara studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not agreement, not trust, but acknowledgement that the path forward existed, even if it had not yet been walked. Ethan reached for her coat, handing it to her without stepping too close, his movements deliberate, respectful of the space she maintained. She accepted it without hesitation, slipping it on with the same calm precision she had shown in everything else. "You do not ask many questions," she said as she adjusted the sleeves. Ethan met her gaze. "I am learning when questions are not what is needed," he replied. Amara's expression softened slightly, the smallest shift, but enough to register. "And what is needed?" she asked. Ethan considered the answer, not rushing, not filling the space too quickly. "Presence," he said finally. Amara held his gaze, and for a moment, something in her eyes changed, not fully, not completely, but enough to suggest that what he said had reached something real. "Then stay present," she said. The instruction was simple, but it carried everything. Ethan nodded once, the motion steady, grounded in something that no longer needed to be explained. They moved toward the door together, not side by side, not in step, but in the same direction, the quiet rhythm of their movement matching without effort. The hallway beyond was brighter now, filled with the soft hum of a building waking up, nurses moving, voices low, the world continuing in its usual pattern. But for Ethan, everything felt different, not because the world had changed, but because he had. As they reached the exit, the morning light greeted them fully, open, clear, and for a brief moment, Ethan paused, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, recognizing that this was not an ending, not a conclusion, but the beginning of something that would require more from him than anything he had ever committed to before. Amara stepped forward without waiting, her posture steady, her direction clear, and Ethan followed, not leading, not controlling, but staying exactly where he said he would, present, consistent, and finally moving forward in a way that did not depend on knowing what came next. The morning air outside carried a different kind of clarity, crisp and open, the kind that made every sound sharper, every movement more defined. And as Ethan Cole stepped out beside Amara Hayes, the world felt wider than it had just hours ago, no longer contained by walls or quiet rooms, but stretched across streets, sidewalks, and distant buildings waking into their routines. And yet, despite the movement around them, something between them remained steady, anchored in the same quiet rhythm they had built in that hospital room. Amara paused briefly near the curb, her gaze moving across the street as if mapping her next step with the same calm precision she had shown in everything else, her hand resting lightly over her stomach, not tense, not uncertain, simply present, and Ethan stood just a few feet behind her, not directing, not interrupting, but aware of every detail, the way she shifted her weight, the way her breathing aligned with her movement, the way she did not rush even when the world around her did. "You do not hesitate," he said quietly. Amara glanced at him, her expression neutral but attentive. "I decide before I move," she replied. Ethan nodded once, the answer fitting exactly with everything he had begun to understand about her. And now, he asked, have you decided? Amara looked ahead again, her eyes scanning the street, the passing cars, the rhythm of the city unfolding in front of her. Yes, she said simply. Ethan waited, not pressing, not filling the space, allowing her to continue when she chose to. There is a place about 20 minutes from here, she added. It is quiet. It is enough. Ethan absorbed the words, the distance, the intention, and nodded once. Then that is where we go, he said. Amara did not object. She did not question. She simply stepped forward, and Ethan followed, not leading, not overtaking, but staying aligned with her pace, her direction. The car waited just ahead, its presence familiar to him but distant from the moment they were in, and as he opened the passenger door, he did not gesture for her to sit immediately. He simply held it open, giving her the space to choose, and she did, stepping in with the same quiet certainty she had carried since the moment he first saw her in the road. The drive was different from the night before. The rain was gone, replaced by clear streets and early sunlight that reflected off glass buildings and storefront windows, casting light into the car in brief, shifting patterns that moved across the dashboard in their hands, and Ethan found himself noticing those patterns, noticing the way the light touched her face, the way she sat with her gaze forward, not distant, not distracted, simply present in the movement. You do not ask where I am taking you, he said after a while. Amara's eyes remained forward. You already told me, she replied. You are taking me where I chose. Ethan let out a quiet breath, a faint acknowledgement of the trust implied in that statement, even if it was not spoken as trust. And you are comfortable with that, he said. Amara nodded slightly. Because I am still the one deciding where I go, she said. The distinction was clear, and Ethan understood it fully now, the difference between control and direction, between being led and being accompanied. The city gradually shifted as they drove, the tall buildings giving way to quieter streets, smaller structures, less movement, more space, and the change in environment matched the shift in tone between them, less guarded, less defined by tension, more grounded in something that did not need to be explained. When they finally turned onto a narrower road lined with trees, just beginning to show early green leaves, Amara spoke again. Here, she said. Ethan slowed the car, following her direction without question, pulling up in front of a modest building set slightly back from the street. Its exterior simple but well kept, its presence quiet in a way that felt intentional rather than neglected. He turned off the engine, the silence that followed immediate but not empty, and for a moment, neither of them moved. This is enough, Amara said softly, more to herself than to him. Ethan looked at the building, then back at her. If it ever is not, he said, you will tell me. Amara glanced at him, her expression steady. I will decide, she corrected. Ethan nodded once. And I will listen, he replied. The exchange was simple, but it carried the weight of everything they had begun to establish, a rhythm of statement and acknowledgement that did not need agreement to continue. Amara reached for the door handle, opening it and stepping out without hesitation, her movements careful but confident, her posture unchanged in its quiet strength, and Ethan followed, closing the distance just enough to remain present without imposing, his awareness focused not on directing her, but on being ready if she needed him, though he already knew she would not ask easily. She paused briefly at the entrance, her hand resting lightly against the door as if marking the transition from one space to another, then stepped inside, and Ethan followed again. The interior just as quiet as the exterior, clean, simple, filled with soft light that filtered through large windows and settled across the floor in warm, even tones. It was not luxurious. It was not expansive, but it was intentional, every detail aligned with the same clarity she carried in herself. You built this, he said, his voice quieter now, recognizing something more than just a place. Amara turned slightly, meeting his gaze. I chose it, she replied. That is different. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding the distinction again, the difference between creating and selecting, between constructing something new and recognizing what already fit. And now I am here, he said. Amara held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not agreement, not acceptance, but acknowledgement that his presence had crossed into her space, not just physically, but in a way that would now require more than words to maintain. Yes, she said. Now you are here. The words settled into the room, quiet but definitive, marking not an ending, not a resolution, but the beginning of something that would test whether what he had said, what he had chosen, could hold its shape outside the controlled environment of a hospital room and into the reality she had built without him. And Ethan Cole stood there, aware of that shift, aware of the weight of what came next, and for the first time, he did not try to calculate it, did not try to define it. He simply remained where he was, present, consistent, exactly as he said he would be. The door closed behind them with a soft, final click that did not echo but settled into the space like a quiet boundary. And for a moment, neither Ethan Cole nor Amara Hayes moved. The stillness inside the apartment different from the hospital, more personal, more defined, as if every object, every corner, carried intention rather than function, and Ethan stood just inside the entryway, his presence careful, measured, not out of hesitation but out of respect for a space that was not his and had never needed him to exist. The light filtered in through wide windows along the far wall, soft and even, illuminating a room that was simple but deliberate. A small couch placed precisely, a table cleared of clutter, a single shelf holding a few books, and a folded blanket. Everything arranged with a kind of quiet discipline that mirrored the way Amara carried herself. She moved forward without looking back, her steps steady, unhurried, her hand resting again over her stomach as if confirming that nothing had shifted in the transition from one place to another, and Ethan watched that movement closely, recognizing it now not as habit, but as consistency, the same pattern she had repeated without variation since the moment he met her. "You do not fill space," he said, his voice low, almost reflective. Amara paused near the center of the room, turning slightly toward him, her expression calm. "Space does not need to be filled," she replied. "It needs to be respected." The words settled into the room, and Ethan nodded once, understanding that this was not just about the apartment, but about everything she had built, everything she maintained without excess, without noise. He stepped further inside then, closing the distance just enough to stand within the room rather than at its edge, his movements deliberate, careful not to disrupt the balance she had established. "You live here alone," he said, not as a question, but as an observation shaped by what he saw and what he had already come to understand. Amara nodded once. "Yes." Ethan glanced around again, taking in the details more closely now, the absence of unnecessary items, the presence of only what served a purpose, and something about that struck him differently than the environments he was used to, spaces filled to impress, to display, to assert control. This space did none of that. It simply existed, quietly, fully. "You have prepared everything," he said. Amara moved toward the couch, sitting down slowly, her posture still upright, still composed, her hand resting again where it always returned. "I prepared what I could," she said. "The rest does not need to be forced." Ethan remained standing for a moment, then took a seat in the chair opposite her, positioning himself not too close, not too far, maintaining the same respectful distance he had learned to hold. "And now," he asked, "what happens now?" Amara looked at him, her gaze steady, not guarded, but not open either, balanced in a way that did not invite assumption. "Now you continue what you said," she replied. "You stay." The simplicity of the instruction carried more weight here than it had anywhere else, because now there were no walls separating them from reality, no structured environment to hold the boundaries in place, only her space and his choice to remain within it without reshaping it. Ethan nodded once. "I will." Amara watched him for a moment longer, then shifted slightly, reaching for a glass of water on the table beside her, taking a small sip before setting it back down with the same quiet precision she applied to everything. "Staying is not the same as being here," she said. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening. "Explain that," he said. Amara met his gaze, her voice calm, measured. "Being here is physical," she said. "Staying is consistent." The distinction landed clearly, and Ethan felt it settle deeper than anything else, not because it was complicated, but because it was exact. "Then I will stay," he said again, this time without the need to emphasize it. Amara did not respond immediately. She studied him, not questioning, not challenging, but observing, as if measuring whether the repetition of his words aligned with the steadiness of his presence. After a moment, she nodded slightly, not agreement, not trust, but acknowledgement that he had heard her. The silence that followed was not empty. It was grounded, stable, the kind of quiet that allowed both of them to exist without needing to fill it, and Ethan found himself settling into it in a way that felt unfamiliar but not uncomfortable. He glanced briefly at the window, the light now stronger, filling the room more fully, then back at her. "What do you need today?" he asked. Amara shook her head slightly. "Today is already what it needs to be," she said. Ethan paused, considering that. "Then tomorrow," he said. Amara's gaze softened just slightly, the smallest shift, but enough to register. "Tomorrow will come," she replied. "It does not need to be decided today." The answer aligned with everything she had shown him, the way she moved, the way she thought, grounded in the present without ignoring what came next, and Ethan nodded slowly, adjusting to that rhythm instead of trying to change it. A quiet moment passed, the kind that stretched without pressure, and then Amara spoke again, her voice softer now. "You are still thinking ahead," she said. Ethan let out a faint breath, almost a quiet laugh, without humor. "It is difficult not to," he admitted. Amara tilted her head slightly. "Then do not think ahead," she said. "Stay here." The instruction was simple, but it carried the same weight as everything else she had said, and Ethan recognized that this was not something he could master quickly, not something he could force into place. It was something he would have to practice, moment by moment, choice by choice. He leaned back slightly in the chair, letting his shoulders settle, letting his breath slow, allowing the space to exist without trying to shape it. Amara watched him for a moment, then gave a small nod, the kind that signaled he had done something right without needing to say it aloud. Outside, a car passed, its sound faint through the glass, a reminder that the world continued beyond this room. But inside, nothing shifted, nothing pulled them away from the stillness they were beginning to understand. Ethan did not reach for his phone. He did not check the time. He did not move toward the door. He simply remained where he was, present in a way that no longer felt forced, and Amara Hayes sat across from him, unchanged in her calm, her strength, her quiet certainty, and for the first time since he stepped into her world, his presence did not feel like an interruption. It felt like something that could belong, if he chose to make it consistent. The late afternoon light shifted slowly across the room, stretching longer now, softer, settling into the quiet corners of the apartment as if it understood the pace that had been set within it, and Ethan Cole remained seated where he had been, his posture no longer defined by effort, but by something that had begun to feel natural. His presence no longer a question, but a choice that he continued to make without needing to repeat it aloud. Across from him, Amara Hayes sat with the same steady composure, her hand resting lightly over her stomach, her breathing calm, her gaze occasionally drifting toward the window before returning to him, not out of curiosity, not out of expectation, but out of awareness that he was still there, still consistent, still present in a way that did not interrupt the space she had built. The hours had passed without urgency, without structure, and yet nothing felt wasted, nothing felt idle, as if the act of remaining had its own purpose, its own quiet progression that did not need to be measured. "You have not checked your phone," she said after a while, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the stillness without disturbing it. Ethan glanced at her briefly, then shook his head once. "No," he replied. Amara studied him for a moment, her expression neutral but attentive. "That is not something you are used to," she said. Ethan allowed a faint breath to escape, something close to a quiet acknowledgement. "No," he admitted, "but I am beginning to see what happens when I do not." Amara tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "And what happens?" she asked. Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair, his gaze drifting toward the window for a moment before returning to her. "I notice more," he said. "Not just what is in front of me, but what I would normally overlook." Amara nodded once, her hand shifting slightly in that familiar, grounding motion. "That is where clarity comes from," she said. "Not from adding more, but from removing what distracts." The statement settled into the room, quiet but definitive, and Ethan felt it align with everything he had experienced since stepping into her world, the absence of noise revealing something far more substantial than anything he had tried to control before. He leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening again, not out of tension, but out of engagement. "There is something I need to ask you," he said. Amara looked at him, her gaze steady, waiting. "When you realized," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "when you knew about the child, did you ever consider finding me?" The question hung between them, not heavy with accusation, but with the weight of something unresolved, something that had not yet been fully understood. Amara did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved downward briefly, her hand resting more firmly against her stomach, as if anchoring herself before she spoke. "Yes," she said finally. Ethan held her gaze, his expression still, controlled, but focused. "And you chose not to," he said. Amara nodded once. "I chose not to," she confirmed. Ethan absorbed that quietly, the answer not unexpected, but still carrying weight. "Why?" he asked. Amara looked back up at him, her eyes steady, clear. "Because I needed to know who I was without you before I allowed you to become part of it," she said. The honesty in her voice did not waver, did not soften, and Ethan felt it settle into him with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. He nodded slowly, understanding the depth of that choice, the strength it required, the independence it protected. "And now?" he asked, his voice quieter. "Now I know," she replied. The simplicity of the statement carried more meaning than anything she could have added, and Ethan felt something shift again, not dramatically, but enough to mark the moment. "And what does that mean for me?" he asked. Amara held his gaze, her expression calm but more open than before. Not fully, not completely, but enough to allow the question to exist without resistance. "It means you are no longer being compared to something you cannot see," she said. Ethan leaned back slightly, processing that, the weight of it settling differently than he expected. "And what am I being compared to now?" he asked. Amara's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. "Consistency," she said. The word returned again, unchanged, steady, the foundation of everything that had been built between them so far. Ethan nodded once, the answer aligning with everything he had come to understand. "Then I will continue," he said. Amara studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged his words without confirming their outcome. A quiet silence followed, but it no longer felt like something waiting to be filled. It felt complete in itself, steady, grounded, allowing both of them to exist without pressure. Ethan glanced briefly at the window again, noticing how the light had shifted further, how the day was moving forward without asking for their attention, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to track it, to measure it, to assign value to it. He simply allowed it to pass. "There is something else," he said after a moment. Amara looked at him, her gaze steady. "If I had come back sooner," he began, his voice careful, deliberate. "If I had not disappeared, would things be different?" The question was not asked out of regret, but out of a need to understand the shape of what had been lost. Amara listened, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and for a moment, she did not respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, grounded. "They would be different," she said. Ethan held her gaze, waiting. "But not necessarily better," she added. The answer settled into the room with a quiet finality, not dismissing the possibility, but placing it in a space that did not allow for assumptions. Ethan nodded slowly, accepting that, understanding that what had happened could not be measured by what might have been. "Then I will focus on what is now," he said. Amara's eyes softened slightly, the smallest shift, but enough to register. "That is all you can do," she replied. The words were simple, but they carried everything, grounding the moment, defining the path forward without needing to outline it. Ethan leaned back again, his posture relaxed, his presence steady, no longer shaped by uncertainty, but by intention that did not need to be spoken repeatedly. The room remained quiet, the light continuing its slow transition, the world outside moving forward as it always did. But inside, something had settled into place, not finished, not complete, but real, something that would not be undone by time or distance, something that required only one thing to continue: consistency. And for the first time, Ethan Cole understood that it was not something he could promise. It was something he would have to prove. The evening settled once more across the apartment, but this time it felt different, not like a continuation of what had been, but like a quiet confirmation of what had changed, the light outside dimming into a deep amber, that stretched across the floor and rested against the walls, as if marking the passage of time in a way that did not need to be measured, and Ethan Cole remained exactly where he had been, not because he did not have anywhere else to go, but because he had chosen, fully and without hesitation, to stay where it mattered. Amara Hayes sat across from him, her posture steady, her presence unchanged in its quiet strength. But there was something different in the way she looked at him now, something that did not need to be named to be understood, something that had shifted not because of what he said, but because of what he had done without saying anything at all. The silence between them was no longer something that needed to be navigated. It was something that held them, grounded them, allowed them to exist without the pressure of defining what they were becoming. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his gaze steady on her, not searching, not questioning, simply present in a way that had become natural over the hours, the moments, the decisions that had led him here. "I am still here," he said quietly, not as a reminder to her, but as a confirmation to himself. Amara's eyes held his, and for a moment, there was no response, no immediate acknowledgement, just the quiet understanding that the words did not need to be validated to be real. Then she nodded once, slow, deliberate, the smallest movement carrying more weight than anything she had said before. "I know," she replied. The words settled into the room with a kind of finality that did not close anything, but opened something instead, something that had been waiting not for a promise, but for proof. Ethan exhaled softly, the tension that had once defined his presence now completely gone, replaced by something steadier, something that did not need to be held in place because it had already taken root. He glanced briefly at the window, the fading light, the world beyond continuing as it always did, then back at her, the only place that felt relevant now. "There is something I need to say," he began, his voice calm, measured, but different now, not shaped by control, not framed by strategy, simply honest. Amara did not interrupt. She did not shift. She simply listened. "I cannot change what I did not know," he continued. "I cannot go back and be present in a moment I was not there for." He paused, not because he was uncertain, but because he was choosing his words carefully, not to convince her, but to reflect something true. "But I can choose every moment from here forward." The statement was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he had learned, everything he had begun to understand, and everything he was willing to commit to without needing her to accept it immediately. Amara's gaze remained steady, her expression calm, but there was a softness there now, something that had not been present before, not fully, not completely, but enough to be seen. "That is all that matters," she said quietly. Ethan nodded once, the answer aligning perfectly with what he had come to understand, not just about her, but about himself. A quiet pause followed, the kind that did not feel like an absence, but like a space where something real had been acknowledged without needing to be expanded upon. Amara shifted slightly then, her hand moving once more over her stomach, that same consistent motion that had become a silent language of its own, and Ethan watched it, not with curiosity, not with uncertainty, but with a kind of recognition that went beyond understanding. "Do you feel it?" he asked softly. Amara glanced at him, then down at her hand, her expression thoughtful, present. "Sometimes," she said. "Not always. But enough." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening, not out of urgency, but out of something quieter, something more personal. "May I?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying a weight he had never attached to anything before. Amara looked at him, her gaze steady, searching not for the question itself, but for the intention behind it, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting not for a decision, but for a shift. Then, slowly, she nodded. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was clear. Ethan moved carefully, not rushing, not assuming, closing the distance between them with a kind of awareness that had not existed in him before, and when he reached her, he did not speak, he did not hesitate. He simply placed his hand gently over hers, over the place she had been protecting, the place that had existed without him for 5 months, the place that now connected them in a way nothing else could. The contact was light, careful, respectful, and for a moment, nothing happened, nothing moved, nothing changed, and then something did. It was subtle, almost impossible to define, but it was there, a small, undeniable shift beneath his hand, something alive, something real, something that did not belong to the past or the future, but existed entirely in that single moment. Ethan's breath caught, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough for him to feel it, enough for him to understand that everything he had been trying to process, to understand, to accept, had just become something he could not deny. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply stayed there, his hand resting over hers, over the life they were now both connected to, and for the first time, the weight of it did not feel like something he needed to carry. It felt like something he needed to honor. Amara watched him, her expression calm, but her eyes softer than they had ever been, not fully open, not fully trusting, but no longer closed, no longer distant. "Now you understand," she said quietly. Ethan nodded once, the movement slow, grounded in something deeper than words. "Yes," he said. The room fell silent again, but it was no longer the same silence that had existed before. It was something fuller, something complete in a way that did not need explanation. Outside, the last light of the day faded completely, leaving only the steady glow of the city beyond the glass. But inside, something had shifted into place, something that could not be undone, something that had been proven not by what was said, but by what had been done, by what had been chosen, moment after moment, without interruption. Ethan Cole did not pull his hand away. He did not look at the time. He did not think about what came next. He simply stayed, exactly where he was, exactly as he said he would, and for the first time, that was enough.